Robert, no one has ever written me a poem before.
I didn't write it. Never written a poem in my life.
My God.
Is she gone?
Yeah,
Nice-looking woman.
she isn't my type.
Liar!
Today on LitePsych, we're going to take a look at relationships through the lens of progression bias. From who to date to why it's easier to get into a relationship as opposed to getting out of one, and why being in a relationship might be better than not having one at all. We constantly hear stories of how it's so hard to date nowadays, that finding the one is such a chore for all of us. And although this is a difficult task for many, it's actually been shown that we're prone to dating a broad range of partners and potential mates. A good example of this would be speed dating, where you have a huge number of potential mates to select from. In speed dating, you aren't as choosy just because you think that the next person who will come can fit what you are looking for. Several studies have shown that people's choices to match with someone aren't necessarily in line with their romantic ideals or preferences. This just goes to show that it's actually not that difficult to end up dating someone because our desires for someone else isn't actually predicted by our standards and ideals in a romantic partner. With this, we've been found to be more satisficers as opposed to optimizers when it comes to looking for our potential mate. Our preferences are heavily swayed by our deal breakers as opposed to the ideal characteristics that we're looking for. In other words, we're okay with dating someone just as long as he or she doesn't have our deal breakers, even if it means that he or she doesn't have the ideal traits and characteristics that we're looking for. We even go as far as adopting the negative characteristics of the people that we're dating. An example would be when we tell ourselves, oh, he's so disorganized, but you know what, sometimes I get disorganized as well. Researchers took it even a step further and found that not only do we have weak dating preferences, but we have a bias towards furthering romantic relationships. Once people believe that they are presented with a real opportunity to date, they become more favorable to that person as they otherwise would be. In other words, if you find out someone likes you, even if he or she is not actually your type, you might actually just end up liking them back. This is referred to as the progression bias. It is the general tendency to make decisions that move your relationship towards more commitment. At this point, you might ask, what about casual relationships like friends with benefits? Hookups, flings, actually turn out to be a stepping stone towards serious relationships as opposed to a replacement for them. Granted, not all friends with benefit relationships actually turn out to be serious relationships, but even when you're in a no strings attached relationship, you are not immune from the strings and the pull that make you want to pursue a deeper, more serious relationship. So far, everything we've talked about is in the early stages of dating on choosing. And basically, we found out that, well, we just basically date anyone. Our standards are actually very low and we're more likely to date a lot of people than what we expect to. Compared to the early stages of dating, research has found that in the later stages, we actually become more selective of the people that we pursue a relationship with, because this is the time when we look at if they're going to be a good long-term fit or not. In the later stages of a relationship, people often get emotionally invested in each other and rely on each other for their support. Thus, if something goes wrong and they break up, it makes it very, very difficult and more painful. Having said this, breakups are then easier at a point when you're not yet emotionally attached or invested to someone else. Other findings suggest that once you hit 2 years, you have a stronger attachment to your partner as opposed to shorter relationships. However, it has also been found that the development of meaningful attachments and bonds within a relationship are developed within 6 months of the relationship. This means that the early stages of dating, the first 6 months, are very critical for deciding whether a romantic partner will be a good long-term fit or not. Moreover, I mentioned earlier that people adjust their ideal standards for the person that they end up being in a relationship with, and this also applies to their life goals. So the goals are also manipulated in service of the person or the relationship. So despite the incompatibilities, a stronger bond in this relationship can still actually be formed. In later stages of dating, aside from emotional investment, partners also start doing joint investments. This includes getting into each other's social networks and being integrated, moving in together, and getting married as well. So aside from the emotional aspect, there's a logistical social aspect to it that gets added on in the later stages of a relationship. All these intertwine when a breakup happens, and it just makes it more complicated. With all these in mind, it pays to invest slowly and cautiously in your relationships. The investment that's been given a lot of focus in research is moving in together. Most of the time, this is because it's seen as a precursor to marriage, and for some people, they can do it as early as 6 months. Some people plan it after their marriage, and some people just go with the flow. Once a couple starts living together, it's more difficult to get out of the relationship because of shared properties, rent, etc., adding up to the social integration and the other logistical things that we mentioned earlier. This gives insight as to why cohabitation before marriage is actually linked with higher divorce rates. Because even if they're unhappy, because a breakup just seems a lot more complicated, they'd rather just stay in the relationship only to find themselves fighting and end up divorcing in the end. Lastly, research has found that investment has a reciprocal characteristic in relationships. That is, if you can see that your partner is sacrificing and doing a lot for you, you will feel the same way and try to do the same thing as well. You will then feel more committed and motivated to contribute to the relationship too. Now, after dating someone for a long time, you tend to overlook certain things or bad habits that your partner does. These may actually be harmful to your well-being. The problem is that sometimes it takes people months or years or never to even recognize the bad things that are happening in the relationship, or that maybe you're just not a good fit after all. In situations like this, and though it may take time to realize, the best call is to end the relationship before it starts getting into more complicated stages, like getting married or having children, and further into the relationship. People choose to stay in these relationships because they're either highly invested already or they have low quality alternatives. Being highly invested is something that we've already touched on. So much has gone in social, economical, financial, logistical factors that leaving the relationship would mean losing all of that. And having low quality alternatives means, well, there's just no one else to date. Unfortunately, being invested often happens in toxic and abusive relationships where the victim feels committed to their partner despite their aggression. Now, compared to decisions that make a relationship go forward, breakups are drawn out, messy, and chaotic. When breakups happen, they don't usually just talk and it's finished. Breakups usually include several attempts of trying to get back together. Additionally, breakups are much more difficult because of decision conflict. Because when you're deciding to break up, you think of all the reasons why you should. Like, it's unhealthy, it's abusive, etc. But as you do, you also think of all the reasons why you should stay. Because he makes me happy, and my family loves him or her, and therefore, the conflict happens. When people decide that they do want to break up, they try to soften the blow out of guilt for their partner. So they try to think of ways to break it slowly and softly to them. But obviously, there is no easy way when it comes to breaking up. All this to say that the breakup is hard for both people involved. So now, let's answer, why do people show up regression bias? The first is an evolutionary answer. It's just evolutionarily advantageous to not be too picky about our partners when it comes to passing on our genes and making children. As long as they meet the minimum specifications, then that's already a viable partner and we can make babies. A biological motivation for people to progress in relationships is infatuation. The intense feelings of passion and dedication pushes us to spend more time with that person, and this paves way for a long-term attachment to form. Once you find a potential partner, not only do your attachment systems fire up, but also your sexual system. You want to be close to him or her, psychologically and physically. So simply just by spending a lot of time with your partner, you consciously or unconsciously see yourself building up to a long-term relationship. Another biological factor for why we have progression bias is when we're in love, our dopamine hits us hard. Basically, dopamine is the reward system for our brain and it gives us pleasure. Romantic love is just pleasurable and you kind of get hooked on it. So the more in love we are, the more we get rewarded. Therefore, we want to keep falling in love. In the same way, when breakups and temporary separation happens, we feel distressed. And it's comparable to an addict who can't get his or her fix. Reason number 2 why we show progression bias is because social relationships are beneficial to us. In Western society, romantic relationships are held in high regard, and single people are often discredited as of lower class. There's a perception that being in a relationship means you have a more fulfilling and satisfying life, and that you have greater access to social capital and different resources just by virtue of being in a relationship with someone else. If you're not in a relationship, you're seen as less successful, less happy, and less mature, despite there being no evidence for these things. Having said this, the social benefits of being in a relationship might push people to stay in relationships that they're not happy with, or to pursue relationships even if they're not exactly in love with the person they're with. We're just in a society where it feels like being single is wrong. So in summary, we're actually not that choosy when it comes to who we date, and we come up with many reasons as to why we should stay in the relationship. And one of which is that it's simply better to be in one than none at all. How have you seen the progression bias in your romantic relationships, or have you seen it in others? Let us know down in the comments. Follow us at LitePsych on Instagram and hit the subscribe and bell notification so you never miss out on the latest psychology in simple terminology. This is Jim. Thanks for watching.